Welcome to Choosing to Matter Cocktails with Chris, a space for open, honest, and unhurried conversations. In today's episode, we sit down with someone who's shaping our world with purpose and passion. I'm your host, Chris Lubkeman. Join me as we explore how our guest has chosen and chooses to matter. Reto Knutti, thank you so much for being here on Choosing to Matter. Now, as you know, we asked you to share with us your favorite cocktail. And what is it?
It's a margarita, although I have to say I'm not too much into cocktails. But if I had to choose one, I think that would be it.
And so why the margarita? What is it for you?
I mean, there are things you like for drinking, and there are things where you somehow have a connection to it. And this was the drink we had when we were in Colorado. That was my first sort of longer stay abroad when I worked there as an atmospheric scientist. And then you sort of get into this New Mexican culture a bit, burritos and tacos, and that's part of the story. And there's still a lot of memories when I drink that I sort of relate back to how the time was then.
And so that was where in New Mexico were you?
No, I was in Colorado.
Oh, Colorado, okay.
In Boulder at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I was doing a postdoc between 2004 and 2007 and so on.
That's good. My son is there in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah. It's gorgeous. Well,
it's a nice place. Of course, as a Swiss coming from the mountains, it's not surprising that we like it there.
That's true. Well, how about if let's have a toast to atmospheric science.
Cheers, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
It's very good. Thanks.
That's good. A margarita. I have different associations with the margarita, but we're not going to go into that right now. That's really good. So what did you want to do when you were 16 years old? Because you grew up in Switzerland.
I grew up in Switzerland, in fact, in the Bernese Alps, in Gstaad, a ski resort.
Yeah.
So if you go even further back, I wanted to sort of be the guy who drives the Casborer, the one who make the
so the tractors to do the grooming of the slopes.
But that was
really?
Before 16. And then at 16, I think I didn't really have a very clear plan.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by science, math, and physics, and started to study physics in Bern. But I didn't really have a career plan in that sense.
So you grew up skiing. I mean, Gstaad is a very well-known, beautiful area, great skiing. So you are obviously an accomplished skier.
I am. Yes. My father is a ski teacher.
He's a ski instructor.
Not only, but as well. Yeah.
And so when you say the physics, when you were at that age, what part of the physics interested you then?
Well, any kind of natural science, basically, but mostly math was interesting, but it was a bit theoretical, but physics was also sort of quantitative, but more applied. So I was interested in the mathematical aspects. I was also interested in computer science. I did a bit of computer science when I studied. And I liked the idea of doing something that was the real world. And maybe that relates to where you come from, the mountains, the snow, the glaciers, the rocks. I mean, the environment and nature was a very strong element from the very beginning.
This is a big part of your life, just as presence.
Yes, I was at that time also doing a lot of mountaineering, climbing, all sorts of things, ski touring. So the idea that maybe combining some of the quantitative aspects to the nature environment, of course, was somewhat obvious. And that's why I probably ended up in atmospheric science.
Yeah.
But I didn't really have a very clear plan in the beginning.
And so you went to Bern to study at Uni Bern?
I studied at the University of Bern, and I did my PhD with Thomas Stocker, famous climate scientist, co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at some point.
And what caught your eye or your heart with climate science? I mean, what was it?
It was a bit of luck. When you study physics at that time, you basically do physics in general, and then you sort of specialize on one topic, and you do a master's project, which was more than a year at that time. And then there were a list of projects, and Thomas had a project on ocean modeling. And I felt like, okay, the environment, climate, but also computer simulation, that sounded attractive. So I did that as a master thesis project, or it was called diploma thesis back then.
Yeah. And then, because as you said, physics can very often, when I think of physics, I think of nuclear physics or fission, and I also think of the sun going also out to space and trying to understand how things work in the universe. And you were focused on our planet.
I mean, that's all really interesting, but I always felt that if I could do something that was sort of relevant for the real world and something that I could explain to my parents and my grandmother, that would be more attractive than, say, space or nuclear physics, which is really interesting, but you sometimes wonder why we do that and how we can use it for, right? I mean, there's no doubt it's fascinating, but if you find the Higgs boson, then what, right?
Yeah.
Does it change the world? And I think it doesn't, or at least not immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas climate at that point was sort of a topic that was coming, and I felt there were a lot of interesting questions where it did make a difference to the world.
Yeah.
And I found that then attractive.
So you mentioned your grandmother.
Yeah.
Let's jump forward just a tiny bit. We missed out a bit there. Yeah. So how would you describe to your grandparents, are they still alive? Or
no, they're not.
How would you, if your grandparents were living today, how would you describe to them what you do?
Well, I mean, I do three things. I educate the next generation of scientists. And I think that's always important. People see us as mostly scientists who do research, but I think we're largely paid and employed to educate the next generation of engineers and natural scientists at the technical school, which is really important.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm a teacher. I'm a scientist who do basic and applied research in climate, basically understanding how climate changed in the past and how it's going to change in the future, using a variety of tools, but a lot of computer modeling. And I am what we in German would call a Wanderprediger, someone who travels around and talks about what he is doing and why it matters. So I'm very passionate about my role of explaining to the public how things are and how they might change and how we might be able to respond to them.
And how do you think your grandmother or grandparents would describe what you do? You described it to them, right? Teacher, researcher, prediger, advocate. What do you think they would say?
It's hard to know. I think when the way I remember her, she was very old, and I'm not sure she would or ever did really understand what I do. She would and she lived in the Simmental, which is a somewhat remote and somewhat I don't know, conservative place with mostly farmers,
but very beautiful. I mean,
very beautiful. But I think even the idea that you could go to Zurich was like, oh wow, that seems like far away. So she would probably think this is some kind of complicated, esoteric thing that she didn't really want to understand.
Sure, fair enough. But it's interesting how times and perceptions change. For you, for example, 2 generations later, you travel the world now.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, my father grew up there, obviously, and sort of he was born in 1945 at the end of the war, and they didn't really have anything, right? I mean, they had one phone in the village, in the whole of the village, and one car, right? So if someone wanted to call, he called the restaurant, and then someone had to run to the house, and it was very unusual to even get a call, and they ate potatoes every evening, right? So they had a very limited view of the world and a very primitive life. And my father then became a teacher, a primary school teacher, and he was the first to have a higher education even. So, and now we're talking about global worlds and yeah. climate change.
Exactly. And it's very interesting to think what you have experienced as a human, growing up in a ski village, knowing your parents who had such a background and that was their lived experience, and your lived experience, and now your children's lived experience with their father being, as you say, you called yourself a wandering preacher. I consider you a very strong advocate.
Okay, we can discuss about advocacy at a later point.
Yeah, we can.
Bring this over.
We can, but but it's interesting how change occurs, and the biggest changes we observe, and we can feel.
I mean, it's remarkable, right? If you think about how quickly the world has changed over the past decades, that's already been extremely remarkable, what we have witnessed. And if you look at the last few years, the whole of technology, the whole of IT and AI, and I have no idea how the world will look like in 20, 30 years from now. We're probably underestimating the potential of future changes that might happen in all ways, in positive ways, but also in maybe problematic ways if you look at the kind of whole political discussions.
Yeah, one of the things we often say, sort of in my neck of the woods, is the future is always oversold and underimagined.
That was the quote of your TED Talk.
That's a quote. True.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is interesting. Let's come back to Reto. With 16, 17, physics was a fascination. You went off to university, and then you focused on climate science, oceans. But the relationship between oceans and atmosphere is a very intimate one. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the topic was described as ocean modeling, but really it was about the coupled ocean atmosphere system, the energy budget of the whole thing. So I started with ocean, but it quickly came into a question of how can we estimate how strongly the planet will respond to CO2 emissions. Right? So we call it climate sensitivity. Basically, if you change the atmospheric composition, how quickly will the system respond, and how strongly will it respond, on what time scales, and what are the processes, the feedbacks, the uncertainties, and so on. Yeah. And I started working with simple models, energy balance models, and then later used more complicated ones and three-dimensional models, and I've sort of stick to that as a core science, but of course broadened out over time.
And the modeling, that was all finite element. What was? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, the simple models are basically box models, right? You have a 1D or 2D representation of the world and a few boxes in the ocean. I mean, there's the upper ocean and then the deeper ocean and the atmosphere, and that's the simplest form of describing the physics of the atmosphere. And then, of course, you can go more complicated. You can go into what we call three-dimensional coupled ocean, atmosphere, sea, ice, land models, where you basically try to resolve every component of the system, all the way to chemistry and maybe humans and cities and agriculture and interactive vegetation. You can go as far as you like. And that makes the model more spatially resolved, more details. It also makes it more detailed in terms of process description, right? So you can go to vegetation that changes over time and as opposed to like fixed tree cover and so on. And it makes it computationally more expensive, right? Because you have to do all those things.
Sure.
And at some point ideally you hope to approach a state where your model is a perfect representation of the reality. Yeah. Which of course it never is.
It can't be.
It can never be. So a model is fundamentally a simplified version of the real world by construction. And there's a famous quote, I don't remember who said it, that the all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? Yes. So they're always idealized, but hopefully they are reasonably close to reality, that you can infer something about reality. And why do we do that? The whole modeling is because we cannot experiment with the whole planet. At least certain things we cannot do. Of course, we do an experiment all the time.
And we're doing an experiment right now, if you will. Yeah, sure.
But it's not really a controlled one. It's not one that you could repeat many times to test different things. Yeah. So some of the things on the whole planet can only be done in the computer in a reasonable amount of time.
So if you think back to the work you were doing then, this was 20 years ago?
Well, more.
Okay.
30 almost.
So,
No,
okay.
yeah. I did my PhD in 2002.
Okay,
Yeah.
so 22, 23 years ago. Up to now, we've learned a lot. We've seen a lot. You've learned a lot. You've seen a lot. What has been the biggest change and the biggest aha for you in those ensuing 23 years?
I don't think we can put this down to one single thing. I mean, do you refer to my own work or the work in general on
Just
climate?
to you. I mean,
to me.
You can answer it as you wish, but I'm curious about your observations at that time as a younger man.
Mm-hmm.
You were researching our planet and our planet's behavior, or trying to understand what's happening, what's going to happen. Now, 23 years later, we've all learned a lot. You've seen a lot. You understand a lot more than most of us. So what's been the big oof or big wow?
I mean, at that time, we didn't really know whether humans were strongly affecting the climate system or not. The 2001 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was the first one to say it is likely that there is basically some effect of humans on the climate. I mean, that there was evidence, but it wasn't like completely bulletproof. And then over time, of course, as the time progressed, the signals got stronger and the observability systems got better and the models got better. We sort of started to do what we call detection and attribution. So you detect change and you attribute a cause. And that has become much stronger on many aspects, not just on temperature, but on rainfall, on extremes, on anything. And then you could use that type of information to make predictions about the future. So once you observe a change in the past, that gives you a way of calibrating, sort of constraining your model, right? And then if you find that the model represents all the things you have observed in the past, that gives you some confidence, not complete confidence, but some confidence that you could say something about the future. And of course, we know a lot more today about all sorts of changes in the future. And it includes large-scale global changes, it includes regional changes, it includes extreme events. But then, of course, you over time, you venture off into other areas.
Sure.
So I have a group of something like 25 people now, and they do all sorts of things. So we worked on carbon budgets, how much carbon can you emit to get to a Paris climate target. That was one of the big things we did for the fifth IPCC report, for instance. We worked on irreversibility of climate change, the fact that things don't go away even if you stop emitting. We worked on quantifying variability, so random variability using large ensembles. We worked on record shattering extremes with Eric Fisher. And the spectrum is very large. And I don't think in climate there's sort of a one thing that you do. It's more of, and I think it's true for many of the scientists, it's more of an accumulation of evidence of a puzzle piece, right? I think Andy Revkin, a famous New York Times journalist, he made this analogy that it's like a puzzle piece where you have sort of 30% put in place, and you realize it's a tiger or a lion. I can't remember. And it's clear that it must be a lion, but there's lots of bits and pieces
still missing.
Right? And maybe one larger bit is completely misplaced, and we're sort of slowly filling in the
puzzle
bits and pieces. But and then maybe that's something for later. This is only like the understanding part, right? Once you have a complete puzzle assembled of the understanding, then the question is, what are you going to do with it? Which is sort of another area that has become more and more important over the last
sort of the
years.
what, so what, now what?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So before we come to that, and all the research you've been doing these past 25 years, the attribution to humanity's contribution has become clearer and clearer and clearer. And this is because, as you said, in 2001, it wasn't quite so clear. Now that's fairly clear.
Yeah.
And that, or it's very clear. Now, what keeps you going? What motivates Reto Knutti?
Well, I think as you said, we know humans are causing climate change with basically 100% certainty. So if the only question you ask is whether we need to reduce greenhouse gas CO2 emissions to limit warming, then the answer is yes. Unequivocally, it's clear. We don't need any science to support that anymore. But there are, of course, other questions that are relevant. And that includes the whole impacts and adaptation and risk management space. So if you go to Gstaad, for instance, where I grew up, this is 1,000 meters above sea level, it's pretty low, right? They're struggling with snow. So if they ask, should we build another chairlift or should we invest in snowmaking equipment on that particular slope? Well, the answer is we sometimes don't know, right? Because of course, global mean temperature, the Paris 1.5 degree targets, they don't tell you these sort of details.
Right.
So if we're talking about natural hazards and how they may change, about tourism, about agriculture, there's lots of things we do not know. Okay? So we do need the climate scenario aspects, and we do spend a lot of time working on these things, on national climate scenarios, as a basis for decision making in all sort of sectors, for energy, for tourism, for agriculture, for water, and so on. And then, of course, the question is, if you say, okay, there's so many millions or billions of tons, depending on the scale, country versus global, of emissions that you can still afford, and then you have to stop emitting CO2, how are you going to do that? Right?
Sure.
What are the technologies and what are the policies? And so the fact that you understand what's happening doesn't necessarily mean you understand what your options are in responding to that, in both the mitigation, so avoiding emissions, as well as in the adaptation risk management space. And that's where we're working on.
And that's what drives you, is just trying to figure this out.
Yeah, I mean, it's the so what, right? So we know many of the facts, but we have a limited understanding of the options, the costs and benefits and the problems of how to respond to that. And which brings us again to this question, how do we get to a common understanding in society on what to do, right?
Yeah.
So you have 10 different things that you could do,
but
which of those should you do? And is there a danger that in the end you're going to do nothing at all because you're divided,
decide.
Right?
Or you can't decide.
You can't decide, or you disagree, right? Which is a real thing right now.
So let's talk about that for a moment, because I used the word advocacy, and you didn't like that word, or maybe you did, but tell me a little bit more about your response to that.
Well, I think so if we go a bit further back, when I was a PhD student, there was a very clear idea, at least in most of the community, that there was science and then there was politics, right?
Yeah.
The science would provide the facts in some written report and say, this is how the science works, how the system works, and here's the data, and then you would hand it off to politics and they would do something with it. Right? And I think we've, for quite some time, come to realize that this is just not how things work. I mean, you can do that, but it will have no effect because politics will either not care or not understand or whatever, right? So someone has to translate that science and explain what it means. Right?
Okay.
So if you go into the front of the camera for a TV and you say, now we unequivocally know humans are causing climate change, then the next question by the journalist will be, so is it a problem and what should we do?
Yeah.
And of course, is it a problem or not is already making assumptions about certain values of what is important, what is dangerous, and so on. And what should we do is making a lot more assumptions about costs and priorities and so on. So once you come into that translation, there's a range of sort of shades of gray between the what some people call the pure scientists, Roger Pilker's word, and the complete issue advocates that would say this is what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And advocacy is often perceived as a negative thing because people feel you're trying to influence politics.
Okay.
And I don't think that's what I try to do. I try to be as clear and as explicit about stating what the facts are and what the risks are, what's at stake, and what might get us to a Paris climate target and what will not work. Right? which is, I think, it's a strong version of outreach, but it's not advocacy in the sense that I would say we need a CO2 tax. A CO2 tax may be one way of solving this problem. There may be other ways of doing it. But I would go as far as saying we have a problem and we need to fix it and we're not doing enough, right? So that, I think, but different people have different views of what the role of science should be and we go.
But I mean, I've heard you many times. I've heard you speak many times. I've seen you on you're sort of a go-to person in Switzerland to have climate science, climate decisions to have that explained. I mean, this is very often you're one of those that one sees a lot, Tim. And I think you're very clear about articulating what is science and what is an opinion. I think, and this is very important, is I think I'm trying to, in my own mind, I kind of think, okay, how do you differentiate between what is scientifically, what is like proven and what you think could or should be done? But you very often don't talk about what you think should be done.
Well, I mean, this is a really challenging issue because we are getting to a point where the scientific information that we provide it cannot be irrelevant to policy, not politics, right? Yeah. So I'll give you an example. If I say Switzerland needs to do more in reducing emissions, that is a completely factual statement, scientifically based, because we have a Paris Agreement that we have ratified. We have a net zero goal voted by the people, right? Yeah. And obviously we are not on track.
There's a delta.
You can measure it. Yeah. We're not on track. So this is a factual statement. We need to do more to reach the goals that we as a society in a democratic way have voted on.
Yes.
But of course, the same statement, we need to do more, is a very policy prescriptive statement that some politicians will say, how dare you telling me what I need to do because you're not an elected politician, which I'm not. No. So we're at a point where the science combined with the democratic decisions that have been made and the urgency of the problem makes such statements quite tricky to make. Right? And I think we can try to do our best in framing things as a requirement. So for instance, you say, in order to achieve the 1.5 degree target, this is what we would need to do, right? Rather than saying we need to, or saying basically these are the possible scenarios. But it becomes
like semantics, and that's how you present it, so it's palatable to.
But of course, the shortening of information in the Twitter sphere and in the media in general makes it hard to have a nuanced discussion on this.
Yeah, I hear you. This is it's very.
And even if you say it correctly, people will take it and shorten it even more until it becomes wrong or misleading.
Yeah.
And I think science has a bit of a challenge that often the answers that we provide, they are rarely black and white. They are often quite differentiated, and often you have to give a bit of context and how this could be interpreted.
This is.
So science communication is a tough business, but a fascinating one and an important one.
No, and it's great because we need individuals such as yourself who are able to speak very clearly about complicated and complex issues.
And I think we need them more than we did in the past because the traditional way of communication by the traditional media is quickly eroding.
Yes.
I mean, newspaper has no money. No one is reading newspapers anyway. No one is watching TV anyway, except for the 60, 70 plus. So the way information is transported and consumed has changed dramatically. And I think a lot of people want to have the direct information from the actual people who do the science. Yeah. And we somehow need to respond to that.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, let's talk about like jumping from today into the future. What inspires you about the future?
If you ask me today,
I'm asking you right now, right here, right today.
I would say, to be perfectly honest, I have mixed feelings about being inspired about the future.
Okay.
And I think it will be useful to talk about what inspires, but also what doesn't inspire.
Yeah,
and I think what inspires is the young generation. At least part of the young generation. It started with Fridays for Future, and it goes on maybe a bit with a bit limited visibility. But there's a lot of young people who start to think differently and who start to make different choices and have different priorities and realize that there's more than just making money for themselves.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of really interesting and great conversations with young people, including very young, like school kids and so on. And I'm hopeful that the next generation will maybe do certain things differently.
Yeah.
The second thing that inspires is technological development. I'm not a person who thinks that everything could be saved by simply throwing technology at the problem. I think it will require other things. It will require political boundary conditions in whatever way. But technology is improving really quickly in some areas.
Yeah.
It's getting affordable. It scales. It's becoming attractive. And once that happens, it will be implemented by many people just because it makes sense. If you look at solar, renewable energy in general, battery electric cars, all of these things, it's not about saving the planet. It just makes sense.
Yeah.
And if we get to that point, then some things will just quickly happen. Right? So these are the things that
inspire you. And what are the things which are on the other end of the coin?
Well, if you look at sort of the last few years, I think we've had a wave of elections and political progress between 2010 to maybe 2020 or so, where the climate was really high on the agenda, and the Paris Agreement, the latest evidence, and elections here and in other countries where you felt, okay, people are really trying to take this more seriously.
There's progress. There's
progress
consciousness.
in society addressing this problem. And I'm afraid this has changed in the last 2 or 3 years. Past COVID, and the causes are well known, right? I mean, it's inflation, it's political tendencies towards mostly the right, it's wars, geopolitics. People are worried about their own safety and their own money immediately, right? Which puts the environment very, very far back on the priority list. And it's become extremely challenging to get anything done on the political level, both nationally and internationally.
So, and thinking about that, the part which is inspiring with the next generations and these little, I call it the micro actions which can add up, and then this current trend of questioning some validity of some of the directions which we're going. What are some of the things which you think we could or should be doing in our own lives to counter that swing back, if you will?
Well, I mean, there's talking mostly about climate because this is my area, but of course there is energy, biodiversity, there is all of these other things too, which are also important. So
soil loss and polluting the oceans.
I'm focusing here on climate just because this is closest. Of course, we absolutely have to reduce and avoid, essentially at the end, avoid emitting greenhouse gases, mostly CO2, which means no combustion engine anymore, no heating with gas and oil, no flying in the conventional sense. At some point, sustainable aviation fuel maybe. Different way of feeding 10 billion people. And at some point, CO2 removal, right? And some of these actions are individual, right? The car you drive, the building you live in, if you have a choice, the food you eat, and the way you travel, you could probably easily get rid of half of the emissions by relatively simple changes in your life, which at least some people can make that decision individually. But, and that's an important but, we have to accept that some of these things will be very challenging if there are no clear political boundary conditions. If you look back at the history of environmental problems from waste to water to air pollution, the ozone hole, asbestos, pesticides, all the way to the pandemic, none of these things was ever solved by individual responsibility alone. None of these were ever solved by spontaneous technological innovation alone. It always needed some kind of societal contract in some form of boundary condition regulation. Right? The CO2 tax could be anything. Right?
What popped into my mind as you just said that was Rachel Carson in Silent Spring.
Second?
What popped into my mind as you said it was Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, the book which she wrote about DDT and observing the eggshells, the fragility of the eggshells in, I think it was Walden's Pond on the east coast of the United States, which then kicked off a movement to get DDT banned.
I mean, there have been instances where substances were simply banned, which was easy if there was an alternative. The ozone hole was a similar problem where it could be basically solved technologically. And I think in such instances, it's relatively easy for politics to decide, right? I mean, we have catalytic converters, we have air pollution regulation. It's fairly straightforward. The car costs a bit more, but otherwise you don't have to change your life. The problem here is that we are talking about the substance, the CO2, which is everywhere. It's literally everywhere. And it's in housing, it's in transport, it's in food, it's in materials. And there is no simple, easy replacement.
We can't just ban it.
I mean, you could, but it would be very difficult.
Well, you and I are made of CO2 as well.
Yeah,
so, I mean...
we're not talking about banning the human CO2. It's just the things we dig up. But we have to realize that this will require a lot of changes in almost every aspect of your life. And sometimes people forget that when they talk about net zero, right? People talk about net zero, which means essentially eliminating emissions, and what cannot be eliminated must be removed. And they casually sort of throw this out about net zero and climate neutral, whatever. And they don't appreciate the fact that this will be a complete transformation of just about every aspect of our life.
So really, what you're talking there is that there's a really fundamental system change, a rethinking of our systems, our living systems, that has to take place.
Yes, I mean, and it doesn't mean that this system, the life after net zero will be bad, right? It doesn't mean that we have to get rid of everything and go back to the caves like 100,000 years ago. Absolutely not. I think in many ways an alternative way of living could be much more productive and even much more fun and much more interesting. Right? But we have to accept that there will be relatively fundamental changes that are required, and you need some kind of mechanism, boundary conditions.
So do you see this more as a revolution or evolution?
If you look from a climate, the urgency perspective, it should be a revolution, because we really have only a few decades, maybe 2 or so. I fear in practice it's going to be mostly a evolution, just because the revolutions are relatively rare and challenging to do, right? And there's too many people who live quite well in the current system, and I don't think we will ever get to the point where we just say, okay, well, let's stop it and do it completely differently. It's both from a societal point of view, it's difficult, but also from a practical point of view. I mean, you have to change all the heating systems of all the buildings, and you just cannot do it.
It just takes a while.
So it's going to be inevitably more of an evolution, which means we're probably going to miss some of the goals that we have set ourselves.
Which is concerning.
But I think we spend too much time. Sometimes, I mean, it's nice to think about the future, right? And have those visions and how those will look like, and you and I both enjoy those discussions. But it also can be limiting in a sense that you feel overwhelmed, and you think, how are we ever going to do this? Right? And will we make it? There's lots of discussions of will we make it to 1.5 or 2 or whatever. And sometimes we forget that we could simply say, turn the question around and say, okay, what can we do today? What's the choice you make to matter today to get us on the right track? And it's sort of like a mountaineering project where you want to go to Everest maybe, and you're in your base camp tent, even maybe in your sleeping bag, and it's okay to think about the summit. It's okay to think about a hilly step and whether it's windy or cold or so, but you're never going to get up there unless you get out of your sleeping bag. Right? So you really have to first get out of your sleeping bag, put on your shoes, and then and your crap, and then you're going to go over the glacier first, and then you make step 1 and step 2, and you may not know in the beginning whether you will make it to the top. Actually, you don't know, right?
You don't know.
But it's fairly clear of what the first steps need to be to try. And I think we should focus sometimes more on trying, right? What can we do today? And then we will make mistakes, we will learn, we will improve, we will find allies who help us, and I'm positive that we can make at least some steps.
I like that analogy, or that metaphor analogy, a lot, because if we think about going from base camp, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that one actually, in order to get to base camp, you have to go up and then you come back down, and you go back up because you have to acclimate. You also have to acclimate to this new system, which is a rare atmosphere, to let your body acclimate. And one day might not be so good. And you make it up a little bit, and you go, actually, no, today's not the day. You come back. But each time you get closer and closer and closer to the goal.
I think that's a good analogy, because we have never done a transformation of society and technology that is even close. Right? This is unprecedented in many ways. And we don't know. We honestly don't know some of the things. And if you look back on how we estimated the potential of solar a few years or a decade ago, I mean, we were horribly wrong, right? So we will make mistakes. And I think it would be important to acknowledge that this is okay. It's okay to try and make mistakes and try to do better. And I'm sometimes worried that in the current discussion, people are, for fear of getting media backlash, they're not even trying, right? They're sort of shying away, either because they're afraid, they don't want to change, or they don't want to risk the shitstorm, so they don't try in the first place. I think we should celebrate the pioneers who try, even if they fail. I think the Americans have a better way of dealing with startup culture. Right? We should celebrate the pioneers. And if it goes wrong, okay, you learn, you fix it, and you try again, right? To Everest, you sometimes have to try twice or 3 times. Right?
Just like,
we cannot afford to stay in the sleeping bag.
I like that. We can't afford to stay in a sleeping bag. I think that's a good one. That might be the title of this of our little episode. You can't afford to stay in a sleeping bag.
Absolutely.
I really like that. So, Reto, how do you choose, in your mind, how do you choose to matter?
Well, I think there are a number of levels, right? You choose to matter in your private life. My wife, my 2 kids. I mean, there's personal priorities and family priorities, which we all have. But when it comes to my professional role, I do often think about what's the thing that would have the biggest benefit for society. And I'm actually specifically not saying impact in a sense that I want to change the world. I don't have the aspiration to be the one who decides what needs to be done. I don't think that's our role. But impact in a sense that what could be the thing that I provide that helps society to be in a better position to have a meaningful debate, discussion, and an informed decision about what they want to do. And that can be done by fundamental science, it can be done by outreach, and by talks, by talking to people. I spend a lot of time just simply talking to individuals, which is never seen or reported in any newspaper, but maybe is more important than anything else, right? Because you establish a relationship, a level of trust that politicians sometimes call me and say, hey, what do you think, right? And there's a shared understanding that we are better off if we work together. They do certain things that they're elected to do, and I can provide some basis for them to make useful decisions.
Sounds like, many individuals need to have that sort of trusted source of, I wouldn't say advice, but trusted source of knowledge and insight.
Yeah, I mean, I think advice is a strong verb, because advice means you tell them what to do. But
that's what I mean.
Knowledge and insight, I think, is useful. And the insight is not, it doesn't end with a scientific publication in the proceedings of whatever, but it really ends with a final product that the end user, the decision maker, can use and understands and is relevant to them. They will ask, why does it matter to me? And it also requires more than just written products. It requires people who actually go out and spend time and do this translation work.
I like the translation part too. I think that's really quite important. In translating in different cultures, different contexts.
Right, and you underestimate the difference between the scientific world we live in and the political world or the business world that other people live in, and they might not understand what we do, right? And we actually, and that's equally important, we might not understand what they do and what they care about, right? So we do a lot of this what we call climate services, which is essentially weather forecast on a decade to multi-decadal timescale, right? Information that I may potentially be using for building, for infrastructure, and so on. But how do you know how they make decisions, right? I mean, the architects and the engineers, they have certain ways of how they make decisions. They have certain norms, and if you find the right entry point to change the norm, then they will make the right decisions because they will build according to the norm. But you have to find out first how these things work.
Let's stay on that for just a moment. Sometimes we keep saying that the weather forecast is hard 3 days out. And 30 years out.
Yeah, I mean, this is of course a common question, right?
Yeah.
The scientific answer to that would be that the weather forecast is an initial value problem and then what we call an initial value problem.
Okay.
And I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
And climate is a boundary condition problem.
Okay.
So the initial value problem is basically you have to know the state of the atmosphere right now to make a prediction 2 hours from now.
Exactly at that location.
So we have to
moment.
have the exact starting point correct, and then the right model to make a prediction for the weather 2 hours or a day into the future. Right? But we do care whether it's raining tomorrow or Thursday or Friday or whatever, right? And we cannot do that for like infinitely long lead times because the weather is chaotic.
Yeah.
But when we talk about climate is usually the statistics of weather. So we're no longer interested in the 5th of August, but we're just interested in how many hot days do we get in summer, right? It could be the 5th of August, it could be the 10th of August, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
And of course the statistics is perfectly predictable. So it's like playing cards or throwing dice. You might not be able to predict the individual throw, but the statistics of playing cards are pretty well known, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And I mean, there's many analogies. You cannot predict the next traffic accidents in town, the specific time and location, but it's relatively straightforward to assume that more cars and higher speed limits will lead to more traffic accidents,
Sure.
right?
So there's a causality which is very clear.
The aggregate statistics of traffic accidents, or take medical issues, right? I mean, the certain distribution of viruses. You cannot say who is going to be infected, but you can certainly say that certain measures will prevent infection in general, right? Heart attacks, right? Speaking of margarita, if you drink less alcohol and if you have a healthy life, you can have a smaller rate of chance of a heart attack, right?
Sure.
Even though you might not be able to predict the individual case.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the boundary condition. The boundary condition for the long term.
The boundary condition is our CO2 emissions and other gases, right, which affect the overall distribution of weather, whereas the weather forecast is really the statement about the individual event tomorrow.
Okay.
That's the difference.
Okay, because I think very often those get mixed up quite a lot.
They're mixed up.
For example, you could have a massive polar vortex coming down and freezing everybody and go, well, global warming. There's no global warming. We're freezing.
Right.
Yeah, things like this. So
you could be unlucky, and you could be lucky for quite some time. But if you wait for a long time, then some of these short-term fluctuations will
come
even out. And of course, I mean, speaking of predictability of climate, the first predictions of climate change were made in the sort of late 60s, Manabe's work and so on. The first computer models were in the 69 or so. And then there were quantitative projections of climate change by Jim Hansen and others in the 80s. And they have turned out to be correct. So we have now at least 30 years of verification. We've predicted the changes in heat waves, in heavy precipitation, the land-ocean contrast, cooling of the stratosphere. I mean, you could go on and on and on of things that were predicted and have now been observed in hindsight. So I think the track record is relatively good.
It's good enough.
It's good enough.
For me, it's good enough.
It's not 100%, right?
No, it's okay.
But you would never bet on the sort of 2% of the forecast being wrong.
No, I would not.
You're better off in trusting the forecast and the best of the science.
So, Reto, what would you like all of our listeners to think about, to ask themselves, to do?
Well, I think if we talk about all of these challenges in the future, and environment is one, but it's not the only one. I think it's important that all of us sometimes reflect and think, okay, what's the future we want to sort of contribute to? Right? How do we think the future should look like? And that's not an easy question, right? There's so many facets and so many aspects that might matter, and we have different ideas about the future, right? Depending on where you are, your conclusions may be very different, but it's important to think about it. And then as a second step, think about how could you make a contribution to that? And again, there is no true and false answer. That depends on your personal situation, your skills. Some of us are best in doing politics, some of us are best in doing basic science, and some of us are best in doing communication, and some are maybe a bit between. Sure. But always think about, could I make a difference? Because in the end, you will be remembered not by the amount of money that you made or how many people you knew, but basically, if you look back, people will say, okay, this particular person, she or he really made a difference.
Sure.
And that's what I try to do.
That's really fantastic. And I think for me, Reto, you do that. We're not remembered by our intentions, but we're remembered by our actions.
True.
I think, and this is, for me, always been very inspiring to see how you're able to communicate in a way I simply have never learned how to be able to do about some of these very, very challenging issues for others to understand and be able to communicate that in a very meaningful way. And I think it's wonderful. And I want to thank you very, very much for making the time to be with me and with us today. It is always a joy to sit with you. I always learn, and you always make me get excited about being the best version of myself. So
thanks very much for the opportunity.
It's been a pleasure. And let us toast, a final toast, and a toast to our collective future.
Cheers. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much for listening today. It's really been a pleasure to share this story with you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon and meeting our next guest. And as always, do something today that makes a difference in somebody's life. Choose to matter.